In 1812, the flames of war once again swept across North America. Washington burned. The British fleet ruled the seas, and America's young armies risked everything against the world's most powerful empire. Yet after 4 bloody years, the borders remained unchanged. So who was the true victor? The answer is far more complex than the legends, and the story begins here. The night air in the Louisiana bayou hung thick with mist and the scent of wet earth. Beneath a moon hidden by heavy clouds, the low rumble of British cannon shook the swampy ground like a gathering storm. It was January 8, 1815, and the final ferocious clash of the War of 1812 was about to explode along the Mississippi River. Thousands of red-coated veterans, fresh from the brutal campaigns against Napoleon, pressed forward through mud and reeds toward a ragged line of American earthworks outside the city of New Orleans. Their polished muskets glinted dully in the dim light, each step a declaration that the mighty British Empire had not come to negotiate. They had come to crush. Across the marshy plain, a strange alliance of Americans waited. Frontiersmen with flintlocks stood beside free black soldiers who had volunteered to defend their adopted republic. Choctaw warriors crouched silently near hastily built ramparts, while French-speaking Creole militia murmured prayers in low voices. Perched at the center of these makeshift defenses was a wiry, sharp-eyed general with a steely resolve, Andrew Jackson. The odds were impossible, the enemy seasoned, but Jackson's presence radiated a defiance that bound the defenders together. At dawn, the sky cracked open with fire. British artillery hurled iron and flame across the sodden fields. The roar was deafening, the smoke acrid. Yet when the redcoats surged forward, they found not frightened militia, but an army of sharpshooters and cannon crews who had spent days preparing every angle of defense. American guns thundered, cutting swaths through the scarlet lines. Within half an hour, the ground was littered with British dead and dying, over 2,000 casualties in a mere 30 minutes. It was a stunning triumph for the Americans, a victory so lopsided that even the British officers who survived were left dazed. And yet, as the cheers echoed across the swamp, a cruel irony hovered over the blood-soaked dawn. The war these men had died for was already over. 2 weeks earlier in the distant city of Ghent, in present-day Belgium, diplomats from the United States and Great Britain had signed a treaty restoring the pre-war boundaries and calling for peace. Neither Jackson nor his men knew it. Slow winter seas delayed the news. The Battle of New Orleans, brilliant and decisive as it appeared, would change nothing on paper. The territorial lines remained where they had been in 1812. No concessions, no new lands, just thousands of lives lost in a fight whose political outcome was already sealed. Still, this seemingly futile clash reverberated far beyond the muddy fields of Louisiana. Newspapers across the young republic proclaimed it a second American Revolution, proof that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest empire on earth. In taverns from Boston to Savannah, citizens toasted Jackson as a hero who had humbled Britain once more. Even Britain's hardened generals grudgingly acknowledged the extraordinary defense. But beneath the jubilant headlines lay a deeper, more complicated question, one that still lingers 2 centuries later. Who really won the War of 1812? Was it the United States, which had failed to seize Canada, yet emerged with renewed pride and economic momentum? Was it Britain, which preserved its North American colonies and global supremacy, even as it abandoned certain maritime practices? Or was it Canada, whose diverse peoples forged an enduring sense of unity resisting invasion? To unravel that riddle, we must journey back to the years before the cannons thundered over New Orleans, back to the simmering tensions, the political miscalculations, and the chain of provocations that dragged 2 nations into a war that few truly wanted but none could avoid. Before the cannons roared over New Orleans, the seeds of conflict had been sown across 2 restless decades. The United States, barely 3 decades old, bristled under the weight of British interference that seemed a mocking echo of colonial times. In bustling ports like Boston, New York, and Baltimore, merchants cursed under their breath as Royal Navy warships prowled the Atlantic enforcing the infamous Orders in Council. These decrees aimed at crippling Napoleon's France barred neutral nations, including the United States, from trading freely with Europe. American merchant vessels, proud symbols of a young nation's independence, suddenly found themselves caught in a vice between British edicts and French blockades. For American sailors, the humiliation was far worse than lost profits. The British Navy, desperate for manpower to fuel its global wars, claimed the right to stop American ships, search their decks, and seize men it claimed were British deserters. In reality, the press gangs often ignored citizenship, dragging any able-bodied seaman into His Majesty's service. This practice, known as impressment, burned like a brand in the American soul. Families in coastal towns whispered of brothers and sons snatched from their ships, forced to fight Britain's battles under the lash. Each story carried a bitter reminder independence might have been declared in 1776, but Britain still acted as though Americans were subjects to be used at will. Meanwhile, on the American frontier, a different kind of pressure built. The fertile lands of the Ohio Valley and beyond called to settlers eager to expand westward. But these same lands were home to powerful native confederacies determined to preserve their sovereignty. Across the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley, leaders like Tecumseh dreamed of a united indigenous resistance to halt the relentless push of settlers. Britain, still clinging to Canada and eager to check American ambitions, quietly supplied weapons and encouragement to these nations. Traders in remote outposts passed along muskets, powder, and promises of support should war come. In Washington, the affronts piled up like kindling. Politicians thundered that America's honor was at stake. Newspapers fumed at each new report of impressment or frontier raids. Southern planters and Western homesteaders alike spoke of a second war of independence, convinced that Britain sought to keep the United States economically dependent and territorially boxed in. A new generation of lawmakers, the so-called war hawks figures like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, argued that only a forceful response would defend the Republic's dignity. They envisioned not just retaliation but expansion, a march into Canada that would sever British influence once and for all. Across the Atlantic, Britain viewed these outbursts with a mixture of annoyance and indifference. The Empire's gaze was fixed on Napoleon, whose armies still dominated Europe. The Royal Navy's blockade was a weapon in a far larger struggle, and American protests barely registered amid the clash of empires. But London underestimated how deeply these slights cut into the American psyche. Each seizure of a merchant ship, each sailor hauled away in chains, each whisper of British muskets in native hands, these were not mere inconveniences. They were provocations that struck at the core of a nation still proving its right to stand as an equal among powers. By the dawn of 1812, tension pulsed like a drumbeat from the Atlantic coast to the western frontier. Farmers in Kentucky worried that British-backed raids would burn their cabins. Merchants in New England cursed the economic strangulation that threatened their livelihoods. In the halls of Congress, fiery orators painted Britain as a bully bent on reducing the United States to a vassal state. The young republic found itself at a crossroads: continue to endure these insults, or risk the perils of war against the world's mightiest navy. The choice, though fraught, seemed increasingly inevitable. For many Americans, the question was no longer whether to fight, but when and whether striking north into Canada might not only punish Britain, but fulfill the long-held dream of expanding the nation's borders. The stage was set for a conflict that would test the mettle of the United States and force it to define what independence truly meant. By the early summer of 1812, the United States stood at a volatile intersection of pride, ambition, and simmering rage. The grievances against Britain were no longer isolated incidents, but a relentless pattern of insult and injury. Each affront dug deeper into the nation's sense of sovereignty, stirring a powerful conviction that America's hard-won independence was being mocked. On the western frontier, settlers whispered fearful tales around their hearthfires. Farmers in Ohio and Indiana recounted raids on remote homesteads, swift, brutal strikes by native warriors who seemed suddenly better armed and bolder than ever. Rumors spread that British traders from Canada were supplying these confederated tribes with muskets, powder, and promises of protection. These were not mere frontier skirmishes. To many Americans, they were proof that Britain intended to hem the young republic in using indigenous alliances as a living wall to stop westward expansion. At the center of this resistance stood Tecumseh, the charismatic Shawnee leader whose vision extended far beyond his own people. He dreamed of a great native confederation stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, a united front strong enough to preserve ancestral lands. Tecumseh's diplomacy was as skillful as his oratory. He traveled thousands of miles to forge alliances, warning that the Americans' hunger for land would never be satisfied. To U.S. settlers and politicians, his growing influence was both a threat and a rallying cry. If Britain continued to arm Tecumseh's warriors, they argued American farms and towns would forever be under siege. Meanwhile, in the bustling coastal cities, a different anger festered. American sailors, free citizens of a proud republic, were being dragged from their ships and forced to serve aboard British vessels. Families received letters sometimes months late from sons who now labored under the Union Jack fighting Britain's wars against Napoleon. The practice of impressment was more than an economic or military tactic. It was a visceral insult to national honor. Newspapers printed scathing editorials comparing it to slavery. The young nation that had fought a revolution to escape imperial chains now watched its seamen shackled by the very empire it had defied. Politicians seized on these grievances. In Congress, the fiery orators of the War Hawks movement grew ever louder. Henry Clay of Kentucky thundered that Britain's actions were intolerable, calling for a firm response to protect America's dignity and destiny. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina argued that war was the only language Britain understood. They were not merely reacting to insult, they envisioned opportunity. Canada, sparsely populated and lightly defended, seemed ripe for annexation. Many Americans, particularly in the South and West, believed that striking north would both punish Britain and expand the Republic's borders. President James Madison, a quiet scholar by temperament, felt the pressure mounting like a storm surge. Diplomatic notes and protests had accomplished nothing. British ships still prowled the Atlantic, boarding American vessels with impunity. Frontier families still buried their dead after native raids. And though Britain was locked in a titanic struggle with Napoleon, her ministers showed little urgency in addressing American complaints. To Madison and his allies, inaction risked more than trade losses. It threatened the very credibility of the United States as a sovereign nation. Adding a final twist of irony, Britain had begun to reconsider its own policies. The costly Napoleonic Wars strained the empire's finances and made the orders in council increasingly unpopular at home. In June 1812, as Congress debated war, the British government quietly voted to suspend the very trade restrictions that had so enraged the United States. But the Atlantic was wide, and news traveled only as fast as the next ship. By the time word of the repeal could have reached Washington, the war drums were already beating. So, on June 18, 1812, President Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war. The vote was narrow, reflecting deep divisions in a nation barely a generation old, but the decision was final. Bells rang in some cities, while others fell silent in dismay. Across New England, merchants who relied on Atlantic trade feared ruin and muttered about the folly of challenging the world's greatest naval power. Yet in the West and the South, cheers rose at the prospect of defending American honor and perhaps seizing new lands. The United States, a republic still testing its strength and unity, had chosen the uncertain path of war. The reasons were many: trade restrictions, impressment, frontier bloodshed. But beneath them all pulsed a deeper motive to prove that the revolution's promise of independence was more than ink on parchment. What no one could know was how ill-prepared the nation was for the storm it had just unleashed. The decision had been made on June 18, 1812. The United States formally declared war on the British Empire. Church bells tolled in some towns, while in others an uneasy silence fell over the streets. Across New England, merchants glowered at the news, fearing that their shipping fortunes would sink beneath the weight of a naval war they could not win. In the South and West, however, the mood was different. Cheers rang out as citizens toasted what many called the Second War of Independence, a chance to defend national honor and perhaps seize Canada in the process. Yet even as ink dried on the declaration, fate wove a bitter irony. Days before Congress voted for war, Britain had already agreed to suspend the orders in council, those very trade restrictions that had ignited American fury. The British government, strained by years of conflict with Napoleon and facing domestic pressure, quietly repealed the decrees on June 16th. But the Atlantic Ocean was vast and slow. The news would take weeks to cross. By the time ships bearing word of Britain's concession neared American shores, cannons were already being primed and militias called to muster. The young republic had stepped onto the battlefield largely because of grievances that, unbeknownst to its leaders, had been partially resolved. President James Madison, shy and scholarly, seemed an unlikely war leader. He preferred meticulous reasoning to bombastic speeches, and he lacked the martial presence of a George Washington. Yet the clamor of the war hawks and the mounting sense of national insult left him little choice. Madison's mind surely wrestled with the decision: was this truly the only path? He understood that the United States, still fragile in infrastructure and military organization, faced a formidable opponent. Britain's navy ruled the seas. Its armies had fought Napoleon's legions for years. Still, Madison believed that standing idle would reduce America to a mere satellite of the empire it had once defied. But war requires more than righteous anger. It demands readiness. And here, the United States faltered. The regular army numbered barely 7,000 men scattered across distant posts. Many officers were relics of the Revolution, cautious and aging untested in the fast-moving tactics of modern warfare. Secretary of War William Eustis owed his position more to politics than to any experience commanding troops. The state militias, fiercely proud of their independence, resisted coordination and balked at crossing state lines. Supplies were thin, training uneven, and the nation's small navy faced the colossus of the Royal Navy, which boasted hundreds of warships. Still, a restless optimism swept parts of the Republic. The warhawks like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun predicted a swift and glorious campaign. Canada, they insisted, could be taken easily. Its population was small, its defenses light. On to Canada became a rallying cry in the West, where settlers saw in the conflict both vengeance for British meddling and the promise of fertile lands. Some even imagined that Britain's North American colonies would welcome liberation, that French-speaking Canadians might prefer Republican liberty to imperial rule. Such assumptions would soon meet the cold edge of reality. Meanwhile, on the frontier, Tecumseh's Confederation braced for the coming storm. The great Shawnee leader had long warned that American expansion threatened all native nations. With British weapons and counsel, his warriors prepared to resist. For them, this was not a war of distant treaties or maritime law, but a fight for survival, for the right to hold the lands of their ancestors against the tide of settlers pushing inexorably west. As summer deepened, regiments gathered along the border with Canada, their ranks a patchwork of farmers, tradesmen, and restless young adventurers. They carried old muskets and untested resolve, marching under the hot sun to the beat of fife and drum. Few could imagine the hardships ahead: long marches through endless forests, bitter defeats at unexpected hands, and a war that would stretch across vast distances from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Thus, the United States embarked on its first declared war, a conflict born of pride, miscommunication, and a profound desire to prove itself on the world stage. The irony of its beginning a war declared after the chief grievance had been lifted did nothing to cool the fiery conviction of those who now prepared to fight. Across the ocean, Britain, still locked in mortal struggle with Napoleon, could spare only a fraction of its might for this distant conflict. Yet even a fraction of the British Empire's power would soon test the mettle of the fledgling republic in ways few Americans could yet fathom. When the United States crossed the threshold into war, it did so with more bravado than preparation. Beneath the patriotic speeches and toasts to victory lay a sobering truth. The young republic was not ready for the scale or complexity of the conflict it had invited. The regular U.S. Army numbered scarcely 7,000 men, a patchwork of veterans from the Revolution and untested recruits who had never faced the thunder of modern artillery. Their officers, many elderly or appointed through political favor, struggled to inspire confidence. Secretary of War William Eustis, a man of political connections rather than battlefield experience, lacked the authority and vision to forge these scattered troops into a disciplined force. The militias, proud of their independence, resisted federal control and often refused to fight beyond their home states. In New England, especially where opposition to the war ran hot, some militias flatly declined to cross the border into British territory. Supply chains were equally fragile. Muskets and powder were in short supply. Uniforms and boots were often ill-fitted or absent altogether. Soldiers marched with mismatched gear, their rations meager and inconsistent. Roads that might have carried wagons of food and ammunition were rough and poorly maintained, turning every movement of troops into an ordeal. Even the nation's finances were shaky. The charter of the First Bank of the United States had lapsed in 1811, leaving the government scrambling to fund its war through hastily arranged loans. Across the Atlantic, Britain seemed an impossible adversary. The Royal Navy dominated the seas with hundreds of ships hardened by years of combat against Napoleon. Even stretched thin by the European War, Britain could still deploy professional soldiers and seasoned admirals with a confidence that dwarfed America's modest forces. Few American leaders doubted the imbalance. They simply hoped British distractions in Europe would keep the empire from focusing its full strength on North America. Yet among the warhawks and their supporters, optimism burned bright. They imagined that Canada, thinly populated and defended, would fall swiftly. Some predicted that a single bold push could capture key forts and convince Britain to bargain. Politicians in Washington boasted that the conquest of Canada would be, in the words of one congressman, a mere matter of marching. Western settlers hungry for land and security echoed the call. To them, victory meant not just honor, but the removal of British influence over native allies and the chance to expand across fertile territories. President Madison, reserved and bookish, understood the risks more than most. He knew that declaring war was easier than waging it, and that the Republic's credibility hung on the performance of its untested army and navy. Yet he also believed that backing down would humiliate the nation and invite even greater aggression in the future. Independence, he reasoned, meant little if Britain could board American ships at will and arm native confederacies against U.S. expansion. Ordinary citizens felt the tension in daily life. In the port cities, merchants watched their fortunes wobble as the Royal Navy threatened to choke American trade. Farmers along the frontier worried that British-supplied native warriors would raid their homesteads. Young men, stirred by talk of honor and adventure, enlisted with dreams of glory, only to find themselves drilling in muddy fields under officers still learning how to command. The nation's small navy, however, held a quiet promise. Though tiny compared to Britain's, it possessed a handful of stout, well-built frigate ships like the USS Constitution, whose heavy guns and skilled crews would soon earn fame. American shipbuilders and sailors were ingenious and bold traits that would prove decisive in the naval duels to come. As the summer of 1812 ripened, columns of soldiers began moving toward the Canadian border. Drums beat time over rutted roads and families waved goodbye to sons and fathers heading into uncertainty. Many believed the war would be short and triumphant. Few understood that the campaigns ahead would be marked not by swift victory, but by harsh lessons in leadership, logistics, and the resilience required for a nation still defining itself. The first American moves of the war pointed north across the rivers and forests that separated the United States from Britain's Canadian colonies. To many in Washington, Canada looked like an easy prize, lightly defended, sparsely populated, and strategically valuable. Capturing it, the warhawks argued, would sever Britain's influence over native alliances and provide a powerful bargaining chip for peace. Yet the reality awaiting American troops was far more forbidding than the confident predictions suggested. In July 1812, General William Hull led an American force across the Detroit River into Upper Canada. Hull, a veteran of the Revolution but now an aging and hesitant commander, faced not a cowed populace but a determined defense. The British garrison at Fort Malden, reinforced by Tecumseh's warriors, harassed his supply lines and ambushed his scouts. Rumors of large British forces swirled through the American camp, sowing fear and hesitation. When British Major General Isaac Brock boldly advanced with a smaller contingent, Hull, rattled and convinced he was outnumbered, surrendered Detroit without a major fight. The news stunned the nation, and an entire American army capitulated almost without firing a shot. The setback at Detroit was only the beginning. Along the Niagara frontier, American forces attempted another invasion, hoping to secure the vital corridor between Lakes Erie and Ontario. In October 1812, U.S. troops crossed the Niagara River at Queenston Heights, determined to seize high ground that commanded the region. British regulars, Canadian militia, and native allies swiftly counterattacked. Amid the chaos, General Brock, the British commander, whose daring had already saved Upper Canada once, fell mortally wounded. His death only spurred his men to fight harder. American militia, seeing the ferocity of the defense and unwilling to cross the river in support, refused to reinforce the initial wave. By day's end, the Americans were forced back across the river, leaving hundreds of prisoners and their ambitions of a quick conquest in ruins. Through these early campaigns, the landscape itself became an adversary. Dense forests muffled the sound of movement, making ambush a constant threat. Rivers swelled with autumn rains, turning crossings into deadly gambles. Supply wagons bogged down in endless mud, leaving soldiers hungry and exhausted. The dream of a mere matter of marching dissolved into a grim march of retreat and defeat. Meanwhile, Tecumseh's Confederation emerged as a force to be reckoned with. The Shawnee leader proved a brilliant strategist, using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to strike swiftly and vanish before American forces could respond. His warriors moved like shadows through the forests of the Old Northwest, their presence magnifying every American fear of frontier attack. For Tecumseh, the war was an existential struggle to preserve native lands in unity against a tide of settlers who seemed unstoppable. Yet, the American spirit, though battered, did not break. Across the young nation, newspapers decried the defeats, but also demanded resilience. The failures revealed weaknesses in leadership and planning, but they also sparked a resolve to reorganize and learn. New generals were appointed, militias were retrained. Slowly, the United States began to understand that victory would require more than ambition. It would demand discipline, strategy, and a willingness to fight on multiple fronts. For Britain and its Canadian subjects, the early months of the war forged a new sense of purpose. French-speaking farmers and Quebec English loyalists in Ontario and First Nations allies found common cause in repelling the invasions. Local militias, once disparate, gained confidence as they stood shoulder to shoulder with British regulars. The defense of Canada was becoming not merely a duty to the Crown, but a source of shared identity, an unexpected outcome that would echo in Canadian memory long after the war's guns fell silent. By the winter of 1812, the United States faced a hard truth. The invasion of Canada had failed spectacularly. Instead of a swift and glorious conquest, the Republic had suffered humiliation and loss. Yet the war was far from over. On the water and in the hearts of a still determined people, new opportunities for redemption loomed. While American armies struggled on land, the nation's fate began to turn on the cold, steel-gray waters of the Great Lakes. Here, amid shifting fog and sudden squalls, the United States found an arena where courage and ingenuity could counter Britain's overwhelming naval power. The lakes became lifelines. Whoever controlled them could move troops, supply forts, and strike deep into enemy territory. In 1813, the critical contest focused on Lake Erie. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, a young and determined naval officer, faced the daunting task of building a fleet almost from scratch in the remote outpost of Presque Isle, today's Erie, Pennsylvania. Shipwrights and laborers worked through bitter winter winds, cutting timber from nearby forests and hammering together hulls under makeshift shelters. Supplies had to be dragged over rugged roads, and every cannon had to be hauled hundreds of miles by oxen. Yet by summer, Perry's squadron brig schooners and gunboats slipped into the lake, their freshly tarred hulls ready for battle. On September 10th, the British fleet under Captain Robert Harriet Barclay met Perry near Put-in-Bay. The morning was calm, the water a glassy mirror, but soon the thunder of cannon shattered the stillness. Smoke rolled across the lake as broadsides roared and splinters flew. Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, absorbed brutal punishment until its decks were slick with blood and the guns fell silent. Undaunted, Perry seized the battle flag emblazoned with the dying words of his friend Captain James Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship," and rode through enemy fire to the relatively unscathed Niagara. Taking command, he unleashed a furious broadside that broke the British line. By afternoon, the Union Jack dipped in surrender. Perry scrawled a succinct message to General William Henry Harrison: "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Those 10 words electrified the nation. The victory secured American control of Lake Erie, forced the British to abandon Detroit, and opened the way for a counteroffensive into Canada. It was a triumph, not just of arms, but of resolve and resourcefulness, proof that American seamanship could match the vaunted Royal Navy. Further east, the struggle for naval dominance continued on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. Shipyards became hives of feverish construction, each side racing to outbuild the other in a contest of carpenters and cannons. Gales and sudden storms added to the peril. Sailors braved icy waves and treacherous shoals to ferry troops and supplies. Though neither side achieved a decisive victory on Lake Ontario, these naval contests kept British forces off balance and ensured that supply lines remained contested throughout the war. The momentum carried south to Lake Champlain in 1814, where another young American commander, Thomas MacDonough, faced a British invasion aimed at severing New England from the rest of the country. On the morning of September 11th, MacDonough anchored his fleet in Plattsburgh Bay, cleverly arranging his ships to pivot and bring fresh broadsides to bear. When the larger British squadron attacked, MacDonough's tactics turned the battle into a trap. After hours of brutal combat, the British commander struck his colors, forcing the invading army to retreat back into Canada. The victory at Plattsburgh helped tilt the ongoing peace negotiations in America's favor. These hard-fought clashes on the inland seas proved that the United States could meet the world's most powerful navy on its own terms. They also revealed something deeper, a spirit of adaptation and tenacity that transcended the Republic's inexperience. Farmers became shipwrights, merchants became sailors, and young captains shouldered enormous responsibility with audacity and skill. Each battle on these northern waters chipped away at the myth of British invincibility and gave the American people reason to believe that the war's outcome was still theirs to shape. By the end of 1813, the echoes of cannon fire across the Great Lakes carried a message far beyond their shores. The United States, once dismissed as a fragile upstart, was proving that it could defend its sovereignty not only on land, but across the vast, unpredictable waterways that defined its northern frontier. The tide of the war was beginning slowly and painfully to shift. As the war ground on, the British sought a blow that would shatter American morale and force the Republic to its knees. By 1814, Napoleon had fallen, freeing Britain to turn its seasoned veterans toward the conflict across the Atlantic. No longer distracted by European battles, the empire could at last devote ships and soldiers to punish its upstart former colony. Their eyes turned to the Chesapeake Bay, a strategic artery that led straight to the American heart. In late August, a formidable British force sailed into the bay, commanded by Rear Admiral George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross. Their fleet included warships bristling with cannon and transports carrying thousands of experienced troops. Their objective was bold: capture the U.S. capital, humble the government, and send a message that Britain remained the master of the seas and perhaps of America's fate. American defenses were a patchwork at best. General William Winder, tasked with protecting Washington, scrambled to gather militia units and hastily trained recruits. The regular army was stretched thin, and the hastily assembled defenders lacked coordination and experience. When the British advanced inland, they met American forces at Bladensburg, Maryland, on August 24th. The battle was chaotic and brief. Despite some valiant stands, particularly from Commodore Joshua Barney's naval gunners, the American line crumbled under disciplined British volleys. President James Madison and his cabinet fled as British troops marched toward the capital. That evening, redcoats entered Washington, their boots echoing through nearly deserted streets. Orders were clear: destroy public buildings and symbols of American government. Flames soon consumed the Capitol, the Treasury, and other key structures. The White House, then known as the Executive Mansion, was set alight, its blazing walls casting an eerie glow against the night sky. The inferno reflected off the Potomac a vision of national humiliation. Citizens watched in stunned silence from the outskirts, the smell of smoke and scorched timber carried on the humid summer air. Yet amid the chaos emerged acts of quiet heroism. First Lady Dolly Madison refused to leave until she secured precious national treasures. She directed servants to cut George Washington's portrait from its frame, ensuring the image of the first president would survive, even if the building did not. In a moment of almost cinematic drama, they escaped with the painting just as British troops approached. The fires burned through the night, devouring roofs and timbers, until a sudden storm, some called it a hurricane, swept through the city. Torrential rain and fierce winds doused the flames and even toppled chimneys, scattering British soldiers and saving parts of Washington from complete destruction. Many Americans interpreted the tempest as providence, a sign that the fledgling republic was protected by a higher power. The spectacle shocked the nation and the world. Newspapers across Europe and the Americas reported with a mix of awe and pity that the United States' own capital had been reduced to smoldering ruins. For some Americans, the disaster revealed the fragility of their government and the high price of war. But instead of breaking the nation's spirit, the burning of Washington ignited a steely resolve. Citizens who had doubted the war now seethed with anger at the desecration of their capital. Recruitment surged and calls for vengeance echoed in taverns and town halls. The British hoped the attack would demoralize the United States and force quick surrender. Instead, it rallied the Republic. Even New England Federalists, long critical of the war, condemned the burning as barbaric. Across the country, men and women who had wavered in their support now spoke of unity and defiance. What Britain intended as a finishing stroke became a spark that hardened American will. As the smoke cleared and residents sifted through the charred remains of their capital, they whispered of retribution and redemption. And only a short distance away in the vital port of Baltimore, the next test of American courage was already forming a battle that would inspire a song destined to become the nation's anthem. Barely 3 weeks after Washington smoldered, British warships prowled the Chesapeake with their sights set on Baltimore, the thriving port city whose privateers had long harassed British shipping. If Washington's burning was meant to shock, the capture of Baltimore promised a crippling strategic victory. Yet this time, the Americans were ready. Baltimore's citizens transformed their city into a fortress. Volunteers dug trenches and erected earthworks that snaked for miles around the harbor. Merchants, sailors, and laborers worked side by side, sweating through humid September days to strengthen defenses. At the heart of the harbor stood Fort McHenry, a 5-pointed star of brick and stone guarding the entrance like a sentinel. Its guns commanded the waters, and its defenders knew the city's fate rested on their endurance. On the morning of September 13, 1814, the British fleet began its assault. Rockets arced across the sky with hissing trails of fire, while mortars hurled explosive shells that burst above the fort in deafening flashes. For 25 relentless hours, the bombardment continued, thunderous blasts punctuated by the eerie glow of exploding shells. The night was a maelstrom of noise and flame. Inside the fort, Major George Armistead and his garrison huddled under the concussion of each strike, yet their cannons roared back defiantly whenever the enemy's ships drifted within range. Farther out in the harbor, aboard a truce vessel, a young American lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched the siege with a heart knotted in dread. He had come to negotiate the release of a captured friend, but now found himself an unwilling witness to the duel of guns and fire. Through the long night, he strained to see whether Fort McHenry still stood, fearing each crimson burst marked its destruction. As dawn broke on September 14th, a hush fell over the harbor. Smoke and mist swirled above the water. Then, in a moment that would echo through generations, Key saw it the enormous American flag painstakingly stitched by Mary Pickersgill and her helpers, billowing proudly over the battered fort. Tattered by shot and shell but unbowed, the banner declared that Baltimore had held. The British their assault repelled, and their ground forces checked, withdrew to their ships, and slipped back down the bay. Overcome with emotion, Key scribbled lines of verse on the back of a letter. "Oh say, can you see by the dawn's early light?" His poem, set to the tune of a popular song, would become the Star-Spangled Banner, an anthem of resilience and pride that captured the defiant spirit of the moment. The victory at Baltimore electrified the nation. After the humiliation of Washington's burning, Americans needed proof that their republic could stand against the world's greatest naval power. Newspapers celebrated the triumph as a turning point, a sign that the United States could not be cowed. Even skeptics of the war admitted that Fort McHenry's stand had united a divided country in admiration. For the British, the failure at Baltimore underscored the limits of their campaign. They had struck the capital and terrorized the coast, yet the Americans refused to yield. With European wars demanding attention and public appetite for a drawn-out conflict waning, London's leaders began to reconsider the cost of further escalation. In Baltimore, meanwhile, the battered but unbroken defenders returned to ordinary life, their city scarred but proud. Children played near the blackened ramparts, and the giant flag, now a relic of survival, became a cherished symbol of a nation learning that its strength lay not in size or wealth, but in the steadfast will of its people. The Chesapeake campaign had shown both the vulnerability and the resilience of the United States. Washington had burned, but Baltimore had endured, and in that endurance, a national anthem was born, carrying forward the promise that the Republic's ideals could weather the fiercest storm. While Baltimore's victory stirred national pride, the war's final and most dramatic chapter unfolded hundreds of miles to the south, where the muddy bends of the Mississippi River guarded the gateway to America's western frontier. The British, eager for a decisive blow, fixed their eyes on New Orleans, a thriving port city whose capture could choke American trade along the vast Mississippi watershed and give Britain powerful leverage in peace negotiations already underway in Europe. The man chosen to defend New Orleans was Major General Andrew Jackson, a fiery Tennessean with a reputation for iron will and relentless energy. Nicknamed Old Hickory for his toughness, Jackson was no stranger to conflict. He had already led successful campaigns against Creek forces allied with the British and was known for a temper as fierce as his determination. When word came that a formidable British expeditionary force was sailing toward the Gulf Coast, Jackson moved swiftly, declaring martial law and rallying every available fighter to the city's defense. New Orleans was a mosaic of cultures: French Creoles, Spanish settlers, free black citizens, and refugees from Saint-Domingue, and Jackson drew them all into his motley army. Frontier militia from Kentucky and Tennessee marched south through winter mud. Choctaw warriors offered their skill as scouts and sharpshooters. Even the notorious privateer Jean Lafitte and his Baratarian pirates joined the cause, bringing invaluable artillery expertise and supplies. Under Jackson's command, these unlikely allies became a single determined force. By late December 1814, British troops under Major General Edward Pakenham, battle-hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, landed just downstream from New Orleans. The city's defenders scrambled to fortify a line along the Rodriguez Canal, turning swampland into a barricade of earth and timber. Jackson worked tirelessly, inspecting every trench, positioning heavy guns, and inspiring his troops with a mixture of fiery speeches and unyielding presence. "Here we shall plant our stakes," he declared, "and never retreat." Before dawn on January 8, 1815, a thick mist cloaked the battlefield as the British advanced in tight formations across the soggy ground. Their scarlet uniforms glimmered faintly in the pale light bayonets, fixed drums beating a steady cadence. From behind their earthworks, Jackson's men waited frontiersmen with Kentucky rifles, artillery crews with cannons, carefully sighted Choctaw marksmen hidden in the reeds. When the British closed within range, the American lines erupted in thunder. Grape shot and rifle fire tore through the ranks with devastating precision. For half an hour, the field became a nightmare of smoke and blood. British soldiers fell by the hundreds as waves of attackers pressed forward, only to be driven back by relentless fire. General Pakenham himself was struck down mortally wounded while rallying his men. When the smoke finally cleared, more than 2,000 British soldiers lay dead or wounded. American losses were astonishingly light, fewer than 70 killed and wounded. The victory at New Orleans was so complete, so swift, that it stunned the world. Yet even as the defenders celebrated, a cruel twist of fate shadowed their triumph. 2 weeks earlier, on December 24, 1814, American and British diplomats meeting in Ghent, Belgium, had signed a treaty restoring the pre-war status quo. Slow winter seas delayed the news. Neither side knew peace had already been agreed upon. Despite its technical irrelevance to the treaty's terms, the Battle of New Orleans carried immense symbolic weight. It transformed Andrew Jackson into a national hero, propelling him toward the presidency and cementing his image as the rugged defender of the Republic. Newspapers hailed the victory as proof that America could stand equal to any power. For ordinary citizens, the triumph offered catharsis after years of uncertainty and humiliation, a final exclamation point to a war fought as much for honor as for territory. The Mississippi flowed on, indifferent to the politics of Europe, but the young United States emerged from its southern swamps with renewed confidence. The ragtag defenders of New Orleans had defied an empire, and in doing so, they gave their country not just a battlefield victory, but a legend of unity and resilience that would echo through the decades to come. The roar of victory at New Orleans reverberated far beyond the Mississippi Delta, shaking the foundations of American politics. When news of Andrew Jackson's triumph finally reached Washington, the nation erupted in celebration. Church bells rang in icy northern towns, bonfires blazed in frontier villages, and newspapers printed glowing tributes to the defender of New Orleans. For a country bruised by invasion and humiliation, the battle felt like vindication, a resounding affirmation that the United States could stand tall among the world's powers. Yet beneath the patriotic euphoria, the war had exposed and transformed the Republic's political landscape. At the outset, the nation had been bitterly divided. The Federalist Party, dominant in New England, had opposed the war from the start, fearing economic ruin and dismissing the conflict as reckless adventurism. While Western and Southern states rallied to defend honor and expansion, many New England merchants quietly traded with the enemy, their ships slipping across the Atlantic to maintain profitable ties with Britain. The war seemed to them a Southern and Western cause that endangered their livelihoods. This tension reached its peak in late 1814 at the Hartford Convention, a secretive gathering of New England Federalists dismayed by the war's direction. Delegates debated constitutional amendments to limit the power of the federal government, and even whispered about the unthinkable secession from the Union. Though the majority favored reform over rebellion, the mere suggestion of breaking away shocked the broader public. Their timing could not have been worse. As delegates drafted their grievances, Jackson's victory and the signing of the Treaty of Ghent turned the tide of public opinion. By the time Hartford's envoys carried their proposals to Washington, they found a city ablaze with victory celebrations, their cautionary words drowned by patriotic cheers. The political cost to the Federalists was fatal. Branded as defeatists, some even called them traitors. They never recovered their former influence. Within a few years, the party that had once produced presidents and shaped the young republic faded into irrelevance. In their place, the Democratic-Republican Party of Madison and Jefferson emerged as the uncontested political force presiding over what would soon be called the era of good feelings. Ironically, the war they had reluctantly waged forged a stronger national unity than the years of uneasy peace that preceded it. For ordinary Americans, the conflict had a galvanizing effect. Volunteers who had fought in distant battles returned with stories of endurance and camaraderie. Families who had watched British rockets arc over Baltimore or feared raids along the frontier felt a new pride in the resilience of their country. Newspapers lauded the courage of sailors who challenged the Royal Navy and soldiers who held the line in frigid forests or swampy bayous. A shared sense of identity, American identity, took root transcending regional rivalries. The war also reshaped how the United States viewed its place in the world. Diplomats and statesmen recognized that independence was more than a declaration. It required the ability to defend national interests on the global stage. The Treaty of Ghent, though it essentially restored the pre-war status quo, was widely seen as a diplomatic triumph because it confirmed the United States as a sovereign equal, not a fragile experiment. Britain, recognizing the cost of conflict with its former colony, would henceforth approach American relations with a wary respect. Even in the face of devastation, the burned capital, the heavy toll of lives and treasure, the Republic emerged more cohesive. Regional differences remained, but the shared trials of war forged bonds that no treaty alone could create. The victory at New Orleans became a symbol of that newfound unity, proof that when tested, Americans could rise as one people. Thus, as the smoke of battle cleared and the nation entered a new decade, the War of 1812 left behind more than scars and stories. It had redefined American politics, silenced a once powerful opposition, and imbued the young republic with a confidence that would guide it through the challenges and opportunities of the century to come. The War of 1812 did more than test the young republic's resolve on the battlefield. It reshaped the nation's economy and military for decades to come. What began as a desperate scramble to arm and supply troops ended as a proving ground for American industry and a crucible for a modern navy, giving the United States new strength and independence. Economic awakening in the midst of conflict. Before the war, American commerce relied heavily on transatlantic trade. British blockades and the Orders in Council had already strained merchants, but once war was declared, the Royal Navy's stranglehold all but severed imports from Europe. At first, this created chaos, shortages of manufactured goods, skyrocketing prices, and idle ports. But necessity is a fierce teacher. Entrepreneurs, craftsmen, and small manufacturers seized the moment. Textile mills in New England expanded rapidly, producing cloth once imported from Britain. Iron foundries and arms factories sprang up to supply muskets, cannon shot, and tools. The embargoes and blockades acted as a rough kind of economic shield, forcing Americans to build what they could no longer buy. Local economies adapted with surprising speed. Town blacksmiths scaled up to produce military hardware. Women spun wool and linen to replace European textiles. Merchants redirected trade toward the Caribbean and South America, where British ships could not easily patrol. By war's end, the United States had planted the seeds of a robust manufacturing sector that would fuel its rise through the 19th century. Banks, too, learned hard lessons. The lapse of the first Bank of the United States in 1811 left the federal government scrambling to finance the war through private loans and state-chartered banks. Inflation surged, and in some regions, currency grew unstable. But the crisis inspired reforms. Calls for a more stable national banking system grew louder, paving the way for the Second Bank of the United States in 1816, a direct legacy of wartime financial strain. The Navy finds its voice. On the seas, the United States entered the war as a minor naval power. Its few frigates and sloops faced a British Navy that dwarfed them in numbers and global reach. Yet the conflict proved that quality, daring, and ingenuity could sometimes outweigh sheer size. From the earliest days of the war, American frigates won stunning victories in single-ship duels that electrified the public. The USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides after British cannonballs seemed to bounce from her thick oak hull, defeated HMS Guerriere and later HMS Java in dramatic engagements. The USS United States bested HMS Macedonian, and the sloop of war Hornet triumphed over HMS Peacock. These victories were small in strategic terms. Britain's Navy remained supreme, but they shattered the myth of British invincibility and gave Americans heroes to cheer. Privateers operating with government licenses harassed British merchant shipping across the Atlantic. Swift American vessels darted from hidden coves to seize cargoes, forcing Britain to divert warships to protect its trade. Each captured ship not only disrupted British commerce, but also enriched American sailors and investors, weaving a network of maritime entrepreneurs into the national war effort. Recognizing the Navy's potential, Congress passed the Act for the gradual increase of the Navy in 1813, setting the stage for a stronger maritime force. New shipyards rose in coastal cities where skilled carpenters and blacksmiths fashioned frigates and brigs from the towering white oaks of New England forests. By the war's end, the United States Navy was larger, more experienced, and widely respected. The confidence gained in those years would carry into future confrontations and exploration across distant oceans. A culture of innovation and pride. The war also spurred technological and logistical creativity. American gunsmiths refined manufacturing techniques, experimenting with interchangeable parts ideas that would later revolutionize industry. In the West, settlers learned to be more self-sufficient, producing food and tools locally when trade routes were cut. Women played crucial roles, managing farms and businesses, while men fought, demonstrating capacities that slowly reshaped gender expectations in peacetime. Culturally, the shared experience of scarcity and ingenuity fostered a sense of national pride. Newspapers celebrated the triumph of American-made goods and the skill of homegrown artisans. Citizens wore homespun clothing, not merely out of necessity, but as a badge of independence, echoing the spirit of the Revolution. Children grew up hearing stories of daring naval duels and community efforts to outwit the blockade, absorbing a narrative of resilience that reinforced the idea of a uniquely resourceful American character, preparing for a larger role. By 1815, when peace finally settled across the Atlantic, the United States stood transformed. It had defended its sovereignty on land and water, developed a manufacturing base less dependent on Europe, and laid the groundwork for financial and military reforms. While the Treaty of Ghent essentially restored pre-war borders, the deeper consequences of the conflict reached far beyond maps. Foreign nations now recognized that the United States could not be bullied or isolated. American diplomats found European powers more willing to negotiate as equals, aware that the young republic had endured the might of the British Empire and emerged more self-reliant. At home, the success of domestic manufacturing encouraged political leaders to support tariffs and policies that would nurture industry, setting the stage for the market revolution and rapid economic growth. The War of 1812 thus became a crucible for American independence in the fullest sense, not merely political, but economic and industrial. The nation that entered the conflict was an agrarian society reliant on foreign trade. The nation that emerged was on the path to becoming an industrial power with a navy capable of protecting its interests. Though the cost in lives and treasure had been high, the gains in confidence and capability would shape the United States for generations. While Americans celebrated their hard-won sense of independence, Britain regarded the War of 1812 through a colder, more calculating lens. For London, the conflict had always been a sideshow to the far greater struggle against Napoleon in Europe. Only after the Emperor's defeat in the spring of 1814 could Britain afford to turn its full attention to North America. Yet by then, the war's strategic value and the will to sustain it were already in question. Global commitments and limited aims. Britain entered the conflict with no grand ambition to conquer the United States. Its primary goal was to protect Canada, preserve maritime supremacy, and discourage American support for Napoleon. From the outset, British leaders understood that their vast empire required a careful allocation of resources. With India, the Caribbean, and countless trade routes to defend, they could ill afford a protracted continental war in North America. The Royal Navy's blockade of the U.S. coast, however, was relentless. British warships patrolled from New England to the Gulf of Mexico, crippling American commerce and strangling ports. Merchant ships rotted at anchor, and coastal towns braced for sudden raids. Yet while these operations inflicted economic pain and occasional terror, most dramatically with the burning of Washington, they never translated into a decisive strategic victory. The American interior remained out of reach, and the long, vulnerable supply lines across the Atlantic made permanent occupation unrealistic. Naval prowess and strategic raids. Still, Britain demonstrated its naval dominance time and again. The blockade reduced American exports to a trickle, starved the Treasury of customs revenue, and forced the U.S. to rely on privateers and smuggling to sustain trade. British Marines staged daring raids along the Atlantic seaboard, capturing and ransoming coastal towns from Maine to the Carolinas. The dramatic assault on Washington in August 1814, which left the Capitol and the White House in flames, showcased Britain's ability to strike the American heartland with speed and precision. In the Chesapeake and along the southern coast, British expeditions sought to divert American forces from Canada and sow panic. They succeeded in spreading fear and forcing the U.S. to disperse troops, but these actions never brought the Republic to its knees. Instead, they hardened American resolve and inspired the very nationalism Britain hoped to dampen: the repeal of impressment and orders in council. Ironically, the very policies that sparked the war impressment of American sailors and the orders in council restricting neutral trade were fading even as the first shots were fired. British politicians had long debated the wisdom of these practices, which angered not only Americans, but also many in Britain's own mercantile community. On June 23, 1812, just 5 days after the United States declared war, Britain formally repealed the orders in council, effectively ending the trade restrictions that had so enraged Washington. News of the repeal crossed the Atlantic too late to avert the conflict. Impressment, too, lost its urgency after Napoleon's first abdication in 1814. With the French threat diminished, Britain no longer needed to forcibly recruit sailors to man its enormous fleet. The practice quietly subsided, not because of American military pressure, but because the strategic circumstances that required it had changed. In this sense, Britain's concessions on the war's core issues came largely on its own terms, reinforcing the perception in London that the conflict had been an avoidable distraction. The Canadian front defense and identity. If Britain had any clear victory, it was in Canada. From the first American incursions in 1812 to the final skirmishes in 1814, British regulars, Canadian militia, and their Indigenous allies successfully defended the provinces from repeated invasions. Outnumbered and stretched thin, they turned geography discipline and local support into potent weapons. The defense of Canada achieved more than military success. It nurtured a budding sense of Canadian identity. French-speaking habitants in Quebec fought alongside English loyalists and First Nations warriors, forging bonds of mutual defense. Figures such as Major General Isaac Brock, who died heroically at Queenston Heights, and the Mohawk leader John Norton became celebrated symbols of a land united against foreign aggression. In later decades, these stories would feed the narrative of Canada as a distinct community loyal to the Crown, yet proudly separate from the United States. Strategic balance and pragmatism. By late 1814, British leaders faced a pragmatic choice. They had defended Canada, protected their maritime supremacy, and avoided a costly occupation of American territory. But continuing the war promised diminishing returns. The Napoleonic Wars had drained Britain's coffers and wearied its people. Merchants clamored for peace to restore profitable trade with the United States, one of their most important markets. Politicians recognized that the United States, while annoying, could serve better as a trading partner than as a perpetual adversary requiring constant military vigilance. Thus, British negotiators approached the peace talks in Ghent with measured confidence. They sought no territorial gains, only a stable border and an end to hostilities. While they hoped to create a native buffer state in the Old Northwest as a check on American expansion, they lacked the leverage to enforce it after American victories at Lake Erie and the Thames shattered Tecumseh's Confederation. In the end, the Treaty of Ghent restored pre-war boundaries and said little about the issues that had started the conflict. Britain could claim that its global empire remained intact and that its North American possessions were secure. A quiet but real success. From London's perspective, the War of 1812 was neither glorious triumph nor humiliating defeat. It was an expensive, distracting conflict fought to a draw, yet it secured the empire's essential interests. Britain retained Canada, protected its maritime dominance, and emerged from the war without significant concessions. The American experiment in republican government had not undermined the empire's authority or invited other colonial revolts. And by making peace with the United States, Britain ensured a valuable trading relationship that would in time outstrip any benefits conquest might have brought. In the years after the war, British officials cultivated a more cooperative stance toward their former colonies. Commercial ties flourished, The two nations settled lingering border disputes through diplomacy rather than force. While Britain never acknowledged an American victory, it quietly accepted the United States as a permanent and independent power, an acknowledgement that carried more weight than any treaty clause. For Britain then, the War of 1812 was a lesson in restraint and pragmatism. It demonstrated that the world's preeminent naval power could protect its empire without exhausting itself in endless conflict. And it revealed that sometimes the most strategic victory lies not in conquest or humiliation of an enemy, but in knowing when to end a war on terms that preserve strength for the challenges to come. While Britain tallied the war's costs in global strategy, the people of Canada, then a collection of British colonies, found in the War of 1812 the seeds of a shared identity. At the time, Canada was not yet a nation. Upper Canada, modern Ontario, and Lower Canada, modern Quebec, were sparsely populated frontier provinces whose French and English-speaking inhabitants had little in common beyond their colonial status. Yet the war and the necessity of defending their homes against repeated American invasions forged bonds that would echo through Canadian history, standing shoulder to shoulder. When American forces crossed the border in 1812, many in London doubted the colony's ability to resist. The population of the United States dwarfed that of British North America, and Britain's regular troops in the region were limited. But Canadians of every background rallied to the defense of their land. French-speaking inhabitants in Quebec, who had endured British rule since the 1760s, volunteered alongside English loyalists who had fled the American Revolution. Indigenous nations, including Mohawk, Odawa, and Ojibwe warriors, fought fiercely to protect their territories and honored alliances with the Crown. Major General Isaac Brock, administrator of Upper Canada, emerged as the charismatic embodiment of this defense, quick thinking and daring. Brock recognized that unity was essential. He forged alliances with Shawnee leader Tecumseh and moved decisively to seize American Fort Detroit early in the war. Though he fell at Queenston Heights in October 1812, his leadership inspired Canadian militia and British regulars alike. To this day, Brock is remembered as the hero of Upper Canada, a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The war also elevated other figures to near-mythic status. Laura Secord, a farmer's wife from Queenston, became a legend after trekking nearly 20 miles through rugged countryside to warn British forces of an impending American attack. Her alert enabled a successful ambush at the Battle of Beaver Dams in 1813, and her name endures in Canadian memory, immortalized even in the famous chocolate brand that bears it. A diverse defense. The defense of Canada was not solely a story of European settlers. Indigenous warriors played a decisive role, using their knowledge of the land to outmaneuver American forces and strike with sudden ferocity. The alliance between British commanders and First Nations leaders like Tecumseh was vital in the early months of the war, when the balance of power teetered precariously. Though Tecumseh died in 1813 at the Battle of the Thames, his dream of a united Indigenous resistance left a lasting imprint on both Native and Canadian histories. Black Canadians, including formerly enslaved people who had fled north via earlier routes of escape, also fought bravely. Units like the Colored Corps of Upper Canada served with distinction, their participation a powerful reminder that the war touched every corner of society and offered opportunities, however limited, for recognition and agency, forging a national story. As the war dragged on and American invasions faltered, the narrative of a united defense took hold. Newspapers and pamphlets celebrated the courage of farmers-turned-soldiers who had dropped their plows and taken up their muskets to repel invaders. Poets and preachers framed the struggle as a defining moment when ordinary people preserved their way of life against overwhelming odds. This shared memory laid the groundwork for a distinctly Canadian identity, one defined not by conquest but by resistance and cooperation. In the decades after the war, writers and politicians drew on these stories to distinguish Canada from its powerful southern neighbor. They portrayed the colonies as a land of loyal subjects who, when tested, stood firm for king and country, rejecting the revolutionary chaos that had birthed the United States. The image of Canada as a peaceful yet resilient society, one that values order, compromise, and collective effort, owes much to the War of 1812. Historian Pierre Berton later described it as the war that made Canada a conflict, that gave diverse peoples a common cause and a shared legend. Remembering the war, even as decades passed, the war's echoes remained loud in Canadian culture. Monuments to Brock and Tecumseh rose on battlefields, and anniversaries were marked with solemn ceremonies. In 2012, for the bicentennial, the Royal Canadian Mint issued a commemorative coin depicting a British sergeant, a French-Canadian militiaman, and a First Nations warrior standing together, an image capturing the unity forged in fire. Canadian politicians have repeatedly invoked the war as a touchstone of national character. Prime Minister Stephen Harper called it a seminal event that confirmed Canada's distinct path separate from the United States. School children learn of Laura Seacord's daring trek, and visitors to Ontario's historic sites hear tales of villagers who faced down a larger foe. Yet the story is not without complexity. For Indigenous nations, alliance with Britain brought little lasting reward. Promises of a protected homeland or a native buffer state dissolved after the war, leaving many communities vulnerable to American expansion and British neglect. Tecumseh's dream of a united Indigenous front against settler encroachment died with him, and the following decades brought new waves of displacement and hardship. A legacy beyond borders. Still, the Canadian narrative of 1812 endures as one of defiance and unity. It highlights not only the courage of soldiers and civilians, but also the ability of a diverse people to rally in defense of their homes. Where the United States often remembers the war as a step toward great power status, Canadians see it as proof that their society, multilingual, multicultural, and loyal to the crown, could survive the ambitions of a far larger neighbor. This founding myth shaped Canada's eventual confederation in 1867 and continues to inform its national identity today. It offers a counterpoint to the American tale of manifest destiny, emphasizing cooperation over conquest, resilience over aggression. In that sense, the War of 1812 gave Canada more than victory. It gave the colonies a narrative of collective strength that helped define a nation before the nation itself was born. As the smoke of that conflict faded and the decades rolled on, the people of Canada carried forward a memory of endurance, a quiet confidence that when the moment demanded, they could stand united against any storm. While the United States, Britain, and Canada each claimed some form of victory or enduring legacy, the Indigenous nations who had fought so fiercely in the War of 1812 emerged devastated. For them, the conflict was never a distant contest of empires or a matter of trade policy. It was a desperate struggle to protect homeland sovereignty and centuries-old ways of life from the relentless tide of settlers pressing westward. When the guns finally fell silent, Native communities faced a transformed landscape in which promises of alliance and protection had evaporated like smoke. Tecumseh's grand vision and sacrifice. At the war's outset, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh embodied the hope of a united Indigenous resistance. Charismatic and determined, he traveled thousands of miles to forge a confederacy of tribes stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Tecumseh saw clearly that individual nations divided could not withstand American expansion. His dream was a vast alliance strong enough to force respect and negotiate from a position of power. British officials eager for allies against the Americans welcomed Tecumseh's confederation and supplied weapons and ammunition. At first, the partnership seemed to promise mutual benefit. British forces gained invaluable scouts and fighters intimately familiar with the terrain, while Native nations received arms and the implicit guarantee of support for an independent homeland. But the alliance was always unequal. British officers viewed Native warriors as auxiliary forces rather than full partners, and their commitment to Indigenous sovereignty was far from absolute. Even as Tecumseh inspired his followers with visions of a lasting buffer state, British diplomats in faraway London weighed such pledges against imperial convenience. Tecumseh fought with extraordinary skill and courage, his leadership instrumental in early victories such as the capture of Detroit. Yet his death at the Battle of the Thames in 1813 shattered the dream of a unified front. His confederation unraveled, tribes splintered, and the British, facing their own strategic calculations, quietly abandoned the goal of an autonomous native territory when peace negotiations began. The Red Stick War and the Creek Nation. Far to the south, another conflict intertwined with the larger war, the struggle within the Creek Nation often called the Red Stick War. Here too, Native leaders wrestled with the question of how to respond to American expansion. The Red Stick faction, inspired by Tecumseh and determined to resist, fought not only U.S. forces, but also Creek leaders who favored accommodation. Andrew Jackson's campaign against the Red Sticks culminated in the brutal Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, where his forces, bolstered by Cherokee and allied Creek warriors, inflicted devastating losses. The defeat forced the Creek to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, ceding over 20 million acres of ancestral land in present-day Alabama and Georgia. For the Creek people, it was a catastrophe. A vast homeland lost, communities fractured, and cultural autonomy severely weakened. Broken promises and vanishing support. The Treaty of Ghent, which formally ended the War of 1812, included clauses calling for the restoration of native lands and rights. But these provisions were little more than diplomatic formalities. The United States ignored them almost immediately, and Britain, eager to normalize relations and resume profitable trade, made no serious effort to enforce them. The British government quietly shifted its policy toward conciliation with the United States, viewing the former colonies as valuable partners, rather than rivals requiring costly alliances. For the indigenous nations who had fought alongside the Crown, this abandonment was devastating. Many had hoped that Britain's victory, or at least a negotiated settlement, would secure a protected buffer state in the Old Northwest, a bulwark against the flood of American settlers. Instead, they found themselves isolated, their warriors dead, or disbanded, their diplomatic leverage gone. In the years following the war, American expansion accelerated. Treaties often coerced or fraudulent forced tribes from their lands across the Midwest and South. The Shawnee, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and others faced increasing pressure to cede territory. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw would eventually endure the Trail of Tears of forced removal that scattered their nations west of the Mississippi. A legacy of loss and resilience. Yet the story is not solely one of defeat. The courage and skill of indigenous fighters during the war became a source of enduring pride within many Native communities. Tecumseh's vision, though unrealized, inspired later generations to continue the struggle for sovereignty and cultural survival. Oral histories kept alive the memory of warriors who fought against overwhelming odds, and these narratives remain vital to the identity of numerous tribes today. The war also demonstrated the complex choices indigenous nations faced. Some allied with the United States, others with Britain, and still others sought neutrality, decisions shaped not by loyalty to distant empires, but by immediate concerns for survival. These choices often led to bitter divisions within and between tribes, divisions that colonizers exploited in subsequent decades. In modern commemorations of the War of 1812, many historians and Native leaders urge a fuller recognition of this indigenous experience. Monuments and reenactments increasingly acknowledge that for Native peoples, the war's end marked not peace, but the beginning of a more intense era of displacement, where earlier histories cast indigenous warriors as colorful allies or footnotes. Newer scholarship highlights them as central actors who understood the stakes more clearly than most Europeans or Americans. The unfinished struggle. By 1815, as American settlers pushed westward with renewed confidence, the Native nations who had fought with such valor found their political landscape transformed. British promises lay in ruins. U.S. treaty guarantees were ignored. Yet the determination to endure culturally, spiritually, and politically remained. Communities rebuilt, adapted, and preserved traditions even as borders shifted around them. The War of 1812 then stands as both a testament to indigenous resistance and a solemn reminder of the high cost of alliance with imperial powers. For the United States, it was a proving ground of national strength. For Britain and Canada, a defense of territory and identity. But for the Native nations, it was a crucible of betrayal and survival, a conflict that revealed both their extraordinary resilience and the relentless pressures that would continue to challenge their existence. As the United States celebrated victories and forged ahead into a new era of expansion, the Native peoples who had shaped the war's outcome faced an uncertain future. Their sacrifices, courage, and enduring spirit remain an essential, if often overlooked, chapter in the story of the War of 1812, a chapter that speaks not only of loss, but of the unbroken determination of nations who refuse to vanish. When the Treaty of Ghent was ratified in early 1815, it restored the status quo ante bellum, the very borders and political arrangements that had existed before the first musket shot. No territory officially changed hands. On paper, it appeared as if nothing had been gained for the enormous cost in blood and treasure. Yet the War of 1812 left legacies far richer and more complex than the simple lines of a treaty could show, and the question of who truly won resists any easy answer. The United States' independence proved and spirit forged. For the young American Republic, the war's greatest victory was psychological. At the outset, many in Europe viewed the United States as a fragile experiment that might fracture under external pressure. By standing firm against the world's foremost naval power, surviving the burning of its capital, enduring blockades, and ultimately repelling invasions, the nation earned a new level of respect abroad. Foreign diplomats could no longer dismiss the U.S. as a rebellious colony. It had defended its sovereignty and forced Britain to negotiate as an equal. Domestic unity, too, took a giant step forward. The surge of nationalism that followed the defense of Baltimore and the triumph at New Orleans gave citizens from New England to the frontier a shared sense of identity. The collapse of the Federalist Party after the ill-timed Hartford Convention removed a major source of sectional tension, ushering in the so-called era of good feelings. Economically, the war spurred American manufacturing and inspired Congress to strengthen the Navy and re-establish a national bank, laying foundations for future growth. Though the treaty did not address maritime rights or impressment, the end of the Napoleonic Wars rendered those issues moot, allowing the United States to trade freely and expand westward. Britain Empire, intact goals adjusted. From the British perspective, the war was a costly distraction from the titanic struggle against Napoleon. Yet in strategic terms, Britain achieved its core objectives. It successfully defended Canada, maintained naval supremacy, and emerged from the conflict without significant concessions. The repeal of the Orders in Council and the natural end of impressment came on Britain's timetable not as a result of American military pressure. Crucially, Britain preserved an amicable post-war relationship with the United States, soon transforming a former adversary into a valuable trading partner. In the decades that followed, Britain would focus on global commerce and imperial interests elsewhere, secure in the knowledge that North America would remain stable. Canada, a nation's birth in battle. For the scattered colonies that would one day become Canada, the war provided an unexpected gift, a unifying origin story. French and English-speaking settlers, Indigenous allies, and local militias fought side by side to repel American invasions. Heroes like Isaac Brock, Laura Secord, and the First Nations warriors entered folklore as symbols of courage and loyalty. Though Canada was still decades from Confederation, the memory of collective defense planted seeds of national identity that endured. The war allowed Canadians to define themselves not only in opposition to the United States, but also as a diverse, resilient community capable of self-defense. Native nations, the greatest loss. Yet amid these narratives of triumph and nation-building lies a profound tragedy. For the native nations of the Old Northwest, the war's end marked the collapse of any realistic hope for an autonomous homeland. Tecumseh's death and the disintegration of his confederacy left tribes vulnerable to relentless American expansion. Britain's abandonment of plans for a native buffer state betrayed the very peoples whose warriors had fought most fiercely for the crown. In the South, the defeat of the Red Stick Creeks led to massive land cessions and set the stage for the brutal removals of the next decades. For Indigenous peoples, the War of 1812 was not a victory or even a stalemate. It was a catastrophe of dispossession, a pivot point, after which U.S. westward expansion accelerated with little external restraint. Layers of victory and irony. The paradox of the War of 1812 is that nearly every major participant could claim success of a sort while also bearing heavy losses. The United States celebrated a surge of confidence and economic growth. but failed to achieve its stated aims of ending impressment or seizing Canadian territory. Britain maintained its empire and global influence, but spent dearly in a war it never sought. Canada gained a unifying myth, yet remained a colony for decades, and its Indigenous allies were left unprotected and marginalized. Even the celebrated Battle of New Orleans, often remembered as a crowning American triumph, occurred after peace had already been negotiated. News of the treaty crossed the Atlantic too slowly to stop the carnage. The soldiers who fell in the Louisiana swamps died for a victory that, strictly speaking, no longer mattered, yet their sacrifice became a powerful emblem of national pride. A war that redefined power. In the broader sweep of history, the War of 1812 helped shape a new balance in the Atlantic world. It signaled the final act of the American Revolution, confirming that the United States would chart its own destiny. It encouraged Britain to view the Republic less as a rival to be contained and more as a partner in commerce and diplomacy. It gave Canada a rallying legend that would inform its eventual confederation, and it demonstrated to the world that Indigenous nations, though betrayed and dispossessed, were formidable actors whose alliances could influence the fate of empires. Echoes through time. The war's echoes reverberate even today. The Star-Spangled Banner, penned by Francis Scott Key as he watched Fort McHenry withstand British bombardment, remains the American national anthem. Canadians continue to honor Laura Secord and Tecumseh as icons of courage and sacrifice. Historians still debate the conflict's meaning, finding in it lessons about communication, diplomacy, and the unpredictable outcomes of war. Ultimately, to ask who won the War of 1812 is to confront the complexity of history itself. Victory cannot be measured solely in acres of territory or clauses of a treaty. It resides also in the stories nations tell, the identities they forge, and the costs borne by those whose voices were too often silenced. For the United States, the war was a proving ground, a crucible in which national character hardened and independence gained deeper reality. For Britain, it was a lesson in strategic restraint, showing the wisdom of peace with a rising power. For Canada, it was the birth of a collective memory that would one day bind provinces into a nation. And for the native peoples who fought with extraordinary courage, it was a heartbreaking reminder that alliances with distant empires could not halt the relentless march of settlers and the hunger for land. When the smoke cleared and the Atlantic winds carried news of peace to every shore, each participant could claim something of value, but none without cost. Perhaps the truest answer to who won is this: the War of 1812 had no single victor. Instead, it remade the continent, weaving triumph and tragedy into the fabric of North America's future.